And welcome to another exciting adventure in Glastonebury Romance, Part B, Part 5. When last we left James Crow, he was arriving, frolicking, I guess you could say, with his cousin, and we had just mentioned that their teeth were white and gleaming in the sun. "Oh, to the devil with it," he cried. "It'll get up again as soon as we've got up. It does from under the cows, and we're lighter than cows. Come on, Mary, let's have our feast." He clutched at her skirt from his seated position and almost pulled her off her balance. She slipped down, however, facing him, her legs drawn up under her, and at once began untying the parcel of bread and cheese, holding it carefully on her lap. High above their heads, several larks seemed bursting their little bodies with their shrill canticle. Their songs were stoical and continuous, with a kind of harshness in its quivering rapture. "Hark at the larks," said John to Mary, watching the careful way she was dividing their viands. As the distributor of the bread and cheese, both the woman in her and the young girl played their part. She made sandwiches for John and herself as if the two of them had stood back to back measuring their differences in size. He, meanwhile, pulled out the cork of the flask and held it out to her, for her to take the first drink. Preoccupied with the sandwiches, she let him hold it till his weary wrist rested upon her knee. But as soon as she had put it in her lips, he jumped to his feet again, murmuring some kind of abracadabra, and poured out what he told her was a libation to the gods. When they had finished all there was of both food and drink, he produced a packet of gold flake cigarettes, and they smoked for a while, contented and at rest. But the larks had come down. The cold wind rendered their exultation intermittent. "Those men were perfectly right," said John. "It has become almost absurd the way, from generation to generation of our family, the older generation outlives the younger. When you came to think of it, it's quite unnatural that 4 cousins, Philip, you, myself, and Persephone, should all be grown-up orphans, and the only child of grandfathers alive should be Aunt Elizabeth. And I'll tell you another thing that's queer, too. Not once of our parents is buried in the churchyard. How do you suppose that happened, Mary?" "How do you know they're not buried there, Cousin John, when you've lived all your life in France?" "Oh, I've watched the family, Mary. Don't you make any mistake. I've watched them like a hawk. I know exactly how much money grandfather's got. I know where every one of the uncles and aunts died and where they were buried. I could write a history of the crows of Norfolk, I tell you, like Runk's history of the popes." "There's never been very much," murmured Mary dreamily, changing her position and stretching herself out on the grass. "You're hitting on your coat, aren't you?" "Yeoman, I fancy, for about 500 years, said John. She lifted up her head to smile at him. "I've never thought much of yeoman." Her next words came with a drowsy, luxurious querulousness as she let her head sink down again. "I wish he had been buried yesterday." They were both silent for a couple of minutes. Then she pushed herself with her hands a little nearer him and took off her hat, fingering it off the grass a few paces off. Flinging it. "I like your hair, Mary," he said boldly, twisting a wisp of it back from her forehead, round a couple of his fingers. "It's the nicest hair I've ever touched. It's just the right tinge of brown. I say it's awfully full of electricity." "I expect you're a great authority," she said. Her remark was made as if it were simply a grave statement, free from all irony, and she went on in the same tone. "How many girls have you made love to, John, in your whole life?" As she spoke, she propped herself up a little, and that time let her shoulders rest against his knees. "God, my dear," he muttered, "do you think I count them? I'm not Ben Pod, so we have to look up who Ben Pod is later." "I've never been made love to in my life," said Mary, "so I don't know what it's like. Does a girl get as much pleasure out of it as a man, John, do you think?" "That's the oldest question, Mary, ever asked of an oracle. In fact, it was the first asked by the gods themselves. Tell me about it, said Mary. I feel just as I did asking you such questions when we went in the boat. They asked the greatest of all soothsayers, John informed her. The old Tertius. And you know what he said? Well, what did he say? He said that in the act of love, it was the woman who enjoyed it most. All the while he was speaking, he was indulging in a delicious feeling of pleasure because she had remembered the boat. I expect he was right, commented Mary gravely, and then, after a pause, I think he was right, she concluded. The Queen of Heaven must have known he was right, said John, for she was so angry that she turned him into a woman. Does it strike you that that was a queer punishment? She fixed her brown eyes upon him. Not at all, Cousin John. It seems a very natural punishment. From a meadow remote from where they were, and at present concealed by the shed, there came to them at this minute the wild familiar cry of the lapwing. I've been wanting all the time to ask you, Mary, he recommenced. Well, I'm pretty popular right now. Whether you remember that day we couldn't get the boat past the dam between the big river and the little river? You said you said just now that you've never been made love to. Why, my dear, I've had a feeling of longing to see you again all my life since that day. I hugged you, and so on in the bottom of that boat. Do you remember that day, too, the way the boat leaked, and how fishy it smelled, and the way I held you? The queer thing was and once more, even as he said these words, the image of the boy Barter rose up. Well. Mary frowned, struggling desperately to evoke the scene he described. She remembered the day. She remembered the difficulty with the dam. She remembered his pleasure as they leant over the rowlocks to watch the fish. She remembered her grandfather's anger when they came home. She remembered with a peculiar sweet sort of shame having asked him various questions. But the one thing she had completely forgotten was his hugging her, and so on. A rather sad smile flicked across her face, a smile that she gave away because her face was invisible to him. You sure remember right which little girl it was, John, she said? And you hugged that day? Her words arrested his attention. He could not tell whether she was mischievous or grave because he could not see her face. You mustn't tease me like that, Mary, he said. You never once teased me in those days, and I never once teased you. There's no need for us to be ashamed of being serious now any more than then. He noticed that one of her hands began to pluck at the grass by her side, but she made no reply to his words. What do you remember, Mary said, about the day at the dam? The silence that followed his words was like the silence of a field at the bottom of a mountain valley, when the setting sun touches the flanks of a herd of feeding cattle. Mary's thoughts were like a rain of bitterness and a dew of sweetness gathered in the hollows of a tree root. A brimming over from then, all would have escaped and vanished if she had tried to express them in any sort of speech. The shame of those questions she had asked of little Johnny Crow was a sweet shame. Then she had forgotten what she remembered was bitter to her. Could it be inventing? Could it really have been another little girl in another boat? How could she have forgotten whether it was her he did it to? Actually, it says, how could she had forgotten whether it was he did to her? But I self-edited in my head. I must have been an imbecile, she said to herself. If he were to hug me now, and so on, I should not forget. His voice continued to murmur on over her head. And what was this? His wrists were under her armpits and his hands covered her breasts. He was holding them very still, but her right breast was beneath one of his hands, and her left breast was beneath the other. That upflowing wave which she had felt before seemed now to encounter a down-flowing wave. Every conscious nerve of her body seemed to be responding to his hands. Her jacket and her dress intervened, or he would have felt her heart beating. He probably did feel it beating. Her mind wandered for a second to the secluded drawing-room of Miss Euphemia Drew in the Abbey House of Glastonbury. Under the pretense of his hands, she shut her eyes and, leaning back in her complete relaxation, Against his knees, she gave herself up to an inner vision of the abbey ruins through those great windows. How often had she sat there in the late afternoon light, in profound unhappiness, watching the rooks gather around the tall elms and the shadows of the great mutilated tower arch grow longer and longer upon the smooth grass. How she had come to hate Glastonbury and hate the ruins, and above all hate the legend of the Grail. Tom Barter agreed with her in all this. They had been the secret of her friendship with Tom. That, and her having come from Northwold. Mary, there's a rabbit in the asparagus bed. Mary, the ducks are in the garden. Oh! How she hated Miss Drew sometimes, hated her almost as much as the ruins. There must be the ruins on the cover here. And in how good the woman had been, putting up with her moods, her sulkiness, her sheer bad temper, treating her always more like a daughter than a companion. I hope he won't kiss me or anything else, she thought. And then she thought, I don't want him to take his hands away. I want him to go on like this, without a change forever. And John thought, I'm English, and she's English, and this is England. It's more lovely to feel her little cold breasts under these stiff little clothes on this chilly grass than all the Paris devices. And without formulating the thought in words, he got the impression of the old anonymous ballads writ in northern dialect, and full of cold winds and cold sword points and cold spades and cold rivers. An impression wherein the chilly green grass and the pewit's cries made a woman's love into a wild, stoical, romantic thing, and yet a thing calling out for bread and bed and candlelight. Lisette would not have the faintest shadow of the faintest notion of what I'm now feeling. England! England! How small, how very small Mary's breasts were. Why, as he held them now, they seemed like the cold cups of water lilies, not like a woman's breasts at all. She wasn't a woman, the newfound love of his. She was an Undine, out of Harold's mill pond. Yes, this is what he had been secretly craving. So long, so long. In his foxy shifts and his wanton driftings and his stormy reactions against the life of a great city, and his pathetic escapes into those whitewashed villages with their orchards, barley fields, and church steeples, and in his crazy, reiterated attempts to do something better than the wretchedness, literary hackwork, in it all, through it all, he had been pining for a moment like this. While this girl was his very other self. What luck, what incredible luck. He could feel her consciousness as he held her like this, holding where a woman's identity, her very soul, must surely most of all lie hid. And her inmost consciousness was exactly like his own. He knew it was exactly like his own. Oh, I needn't kiss you anything, Mary, his thoughts ran. We've met. We're all together. We've got each other now. It's all done. Once and for all, it's all done. He moved his hands from her breast and encircled her thin neck with all his fingers. He could feel the luxury of abandonment with which her chin sank on his knuckles and her head fell sideways. She was feeling exactly as he was feeling, only, as was right and proper, the reverse way. Oh, what magical expressions for the only thing in love that really counted were those old ballad phrases. Mary was not pretty. She was not beautiful. She had what the old ballads had. Yep, that was the thing. The best love was not lust, nor was it passion. Still less was it any ideal. It was pure romance, capital R. But pure romance was harsh and grim and stoical, and a man must be grim to embrace it. Yes, it went well with cold March wind and cold rain and long chilly grass. Well, this is getting quite steamy, isn't it? So we'll take a break for today. That was a Glastonebury Romance Part 5. We'll be back tomorrow with Part 6. Cheers!